Hello again, Dan Alasso here with U.S. History 1, and this is Chapter 11, or Week 11, and this one I call Democracy in America, and I particularly mean Jacksonian democracy in America. So let's begin. So as a reminder, the Speaker of the House and then Secretary of State Henry Clay was one of the main champions of what became known as the American system of high tariffs, a national bank, and federally sponsored internal improvements, such as roads and canals. Despite the successful opening of the very profitable Erie Canal in 1825, as I mentioned last time, many people in Congress still opposed federal funding of internal improvements because they believed that the Constitution did not give the federal government that power to fund those types of projects. Andrew Jackson's victory in 1828 and the appointment of new federal administrators through the regular turnover in presidential administrations and the executive branch, as well as through the spoils system, caused many of the Whiggish programs of the Adams administration to be reversed. For example, Andrew Jackson disliked and distrusted the Second Bank of the United States, and he believed that its existence violated the U.S. Constitution, despite the fact that the Supreme Court had decided to the contrary in McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. The bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, applied to recharter the bank in 1832, 4 years early, at the urging of the people who were still Jackson's political enemies, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Congress had originally established the Bank of the United States in 1791 as part of Alexander Hamilton's Federalist financial program, but its original 20-year charter had expired in 1811. And then, swayed by the Democratic-Republican majority's hostility to an institution that they believed catered to just the wealthy elites, Congress did not renew the bank's charter, but instead approved a new national bank, the Second Bank of the United States, in 1616. And it, too, would have a 20-year charter, set to expire in 1836. Andrew Jackson had faced economic difficulties of his own during his days of land speculating, which had made him uneasy of paper money and distrustful of banks. To Jackson, hard currency, gold and silver, was a much better alternative. The president also personally disliked the bank's director, Nicholas Biddle, who was a wealthy Pennsylvanian whose family actually had emigrated to America with William Penn. A large part of the power of mass democracy for politicians like Jackson was the opportunity to direct the resentment of ordinary Americans against what they saw as the privileges of the few. So aristocrats like Biddle were easy targets for popular animosity. Another leading opponent of the bank was Thomas Hart Benton, a senator from Missouri, who said that the bank's purpose was, in his words, to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. The self-important statements of Biddle, who claimed to have more power than President Jackson, in addition to being smarter and a better judge of the country's economic state, seemed to confirm Benton's claim. Jackson also suspected the bank of secretly supporting his Whig adversaries, especially Henry Clay. When Clay and Daniel Webster convinced Biddle to apply for recharter 4 years early in an attempt to box the president into a corner during his re-election campaign, Jackson decided to confront the issue directly and kill the bank instead. He appointed his friend and ally, Roger Taney, as Secretary of the Treasury in a recess appointment, because he knew the Senate would never approve of Taney. And then Taney oversaw the removal of government deposits from the Second Bank. Jackson would then reward Taney by nominating him to the Supreme Court. The Senate would at first block the nomination, but then when midterm elections sent even more Democrats to Congress and the Senate, and when Chief Justice John Marshall died, Jackson was able to get Taney approved not only as an Associate Justice, but as the Chief Justice. And of course, this would have consequences 20 years later when Roger Taney would be the man to write the decision on the very famous Dred Scott case. But that's in our future. Also, by the early 1830s, the battle over the tariff had taken on a new urgency as the price of cotton continued to fall. In 1818, cotton had been 31 cents a pound, but by 1831, the price had sunk to 8 cents a pound. While cotton production had soared and oversupply had probably contributed quite a bit to the decline in prices, many Southerners blamed their economic problems on the tariff that raised the prices that they had to pay for imported goods, while their own income was shrinking. Resentment of the tariff was connected to the issue of slavery because the tariff demonstrated the power of the federal government to pass and impose laws that the Southern states opposed. Some Southerners feared that the federal government would next move to abolish slavery, which growing numbers of Northerners had begun to oppose. The 1830s is really the era in which Northern abolitionist movements get underway. So the theory of nullification provided these wealthy Southern slaveholders who, despite padding their numbers with the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, were becoming a minority in the United States government, with an argument for resisting the national government if it acted contrary to their regional interests, which are now going to begin to be called sectional interests. James Hamilton, the governor of South Carolina, denounced what he called the despotic majority that oppresses us. Nullification also raised the specter of secession. Aggrieved states who felt that they were at the mercy of an aggressive national majority might be, quote unquote, forced to leave the Union. John C. Calhoun supported nullification, arguing that Jefferson and Madison had first proposed the idea in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Despite being sympathetic to the Southern defense of slavery, President Jackson denied the nullifier's arguments. He and others, including former President James Madison, argued that the Constitution gave Congress the power to, as he said, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Jackson pledged to protect the Union against any who might try to tear it apart over the tariff issue. The Union shall be preserved, he declared in 1830. The tariff of 1832 actually lowered the rates on some imported goods to try to calm the Southerners. It didn't have the desired effect, however, and Calhoun's supporters still claimed their right to override federal law. South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring that both the 1828 and the 1832 tariffs were null and void and didn't apply to Calhoun's home state. Jackson responded, declaring in the December 1832 nullification proclamation that a state did not have the power to void a federal law. Ironically, Jackson himself didn't feel that he had to obey all the laws. Pro-Jackson newspapers had always touted the president as an advocate of what they imagined as opening new lands for white settlement and moving the native inhabitants beyond the boundaries of what everyone thought of as American civilization. In this, Jackson reflected the majority opinion. Most Americans did believe that Indians had no place in the white republic, despite the efforts of many tribes to follow the advice that President Jefferson had given them and emulate the institutions and the culture of the United States. Animosity toward Native Americans ran deep. Jackson had led American soldiers against the Creek in 1813 and then against the Seminole in 1817, and his reputation and his popularity rested largely on his often stated commitment to removing Indians from the states of the South. Democratic politicians and pro-Jackson newspapers portrayed the president as both a defender of the people and as a champion of Western expansion. Popular culture in the first half of the 19th century reflected an aversion to Indians that was nearly universal during the age of Jackson. Jackson capitalized on this racial hatred to gain popular support. And keeping this support required him to direct the United States in a policy of eradicating the Indians from lands adjacent to the existing states to make way for that expanding white civilization. In his first message to Congress as president, Jackson announced that the Indian groups living as sovereign entities within states presented a major problem for state sovereignty. This referred directly to the situation in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, where the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, and the Cherokee tribal lands directly west of the white settlements were obstacles to white expansion. These groups were known as the Five Civilized Tribes because they had tried to assimilate, and they had largely adopted Anglo-American culture. They spoke English, they practiced Christianity, they had a newspaper, they established a bicameral legislature and courts modeled after those in the States. And some Indians had even become plantation owners, holding African slaves like their white counterparts. Whites especially resented the Cherokee in Georgia, where they were also very interested in taking over the rich agricultural lands that the tribes occupied in the northwestern part of the state. The impulse to remove the Cherokee only increased when gold was discovered on their territory. Whites insisted that the Cherokee and other native people could never be good citizens because of their savage ways, although the Cherokee had gone farther than any other Indians in adopting white culture. Cherokee success in assimilating to white culture was of no consequence in an era when whites imagined all Indians as being incapable of becoming full citizens. And Jackson's clear support of anti-Indian policies helped Congress to pass the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which called for the removal of the five civilized tribes from their homes in the southeastern United States to a western reservation in what's now Oklahoma. Jackson, whose reputation as an Indian fighter had helped him become president, declared in December 1830, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. Two important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes to also seek the same obvious advantages." Now, the Cherokee didn't go along. They decided to fight the new federal law, and they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. Their challenge had the support of Jackson's opponents, anti-Jackson congressmen, including Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. And they retained the legal services of John Quincy Adams' Attorney General, William Wirt. But Wirt lost his case. However, a second Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia asserted the rights of non-natives to live on Indian lands with native permission, which was meant to demonstrate native sovereignty. Samuel Worcester was a Christian missionary and a federal postmaster of New Echota, the capital of the Cherokee Nation, who was opposed to Indian removal. So for living among the Cherokee, Worcester had gotten himself arrested, and he was found guilty, along with 9 others, of violating a Georgia state law banning whites from living on Indian land. When the case of Worcester v. Georgia came before the Supreme Court in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall, who was nearing the end of his career and his life, presided over a ruling in favor of Worcester, finding that the Cherokee constituted distinct political communities with sovereign rights to their own territory. Hearing of the court's decision, President Jackson wrote to a supporter in Tennessee, "The decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, and they find that they cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate." And this was paraphrased everywhere as meaning that Jackson was taunting Marshall and saying basically, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So although he had previously disagreed with John C. Calhoun over the principle of nullification, President Jackson was not above ignoring a federal law when it suited him. The Supreme Court, of course, didn't have any power to enforce its ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, because that was a power that the Constitution gave to the executive branch. And it quickly became clear that the Cherokee were going to be forced to move. The president sent in the U.S. Army to remove the Indians, and about 16,000 Cherokee were relocated at gunpoint to Oklahoma. And this forced migration, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of as many as half of the Cherokee people along the way. The Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples were also compelled to leave their homes. By the end of the 1830s, nearly 50,000 Indians had been removed from their southeastern homelands, And that opened 25 million new acres for white settlement and cotton plantations. The removal of the 5 civilized tribes is an early example of the power of majority opinion, what in the last chapter we celebrated as the will of the people, to override the rule of law in a democracy. In his re-election campaign of 1832, Jackson replaced nullification advocate John C. Calhoun, who had been not only John Quincy Adams' vice president, but also his in his first term, with a new vice presidential running mate, New York bucktail Martin Van Buren. And in this election, Jackson was opposed by Henry Clay, who actually ran for president unsuccessfully 5 times. And in this election, this anti-Jackson wing of the Democratic Republican Party began to take the name of Whig, in memory of the Englishmen who had opposed absolute monarchy in 1688 before the Glorious Revolution, and then the patriots of the American Revolution who had also taken on that title. And Jackson's opponents hoped to use their support of the Second Bank to their advantage, and so they pushed for legislation that would recharter it, even though its charter wasn't scheduled to expire until 1836. When the bill passed and came to the president's desk, he vetoed the measure. Jackson took advantage of the people's anger and distrust toward the bank, which stood as an emblem of special privilege and big government. As Jackson imagined and portrayed the political stakes, he was fighting for small government and ordinary Americans against the monster bank. In the election of 1832, Jackson received nearly 55% of the popular vote against Clay. The veto was only part of Jackson's war on the monster bank. In 1833, as I've said, the president put Roger Taney in a position to remove all the deposits from the bank and put them in the state banks. Nicholas Biddle, the bank's director, retaliated by restricting loans to the state banks, and that reduced the national money supply. And the financial turmoil increased when Jackson issued an executive order known as the Specie Circular, which required that Western land sales had to be conducted using specie, gold and silver only, rather than using paper banknotes or credit. Jackson's policies led to disaster when the Bank of England, the source of most of the credit relied on by American businesses, dramatically cut back loans to the U.S. Without the flow of credit from England, American depositors withdrew gold and silver from domestic banks, and that made hard currency scarce. And adding to the economic distress of the late 1830s, cotton prices continued to plummet. And this led to a financial crisis called the Panic of 1837. A deep recession that followed lasted until the mid-1840s and proved politically useful for Jackson's opponents in the coming years. Martin Van Buren, who was elected president in 1836 after Jackson had served 2 terms, would pay the price for Jackson's hard currency preferences. The U.S. government's policy of forced removal led some Indians to actively resist. In 1832, the Fox and Sauk tribes, led by a Sauk chief who the Americans called Black Hawk, moved back across the Mississippi River to the territory between the Illinois and the Mississippi rivers to reclaim their ancestral homeland in northern Illinois. Black Hawk's War began when white settlers panicked at the return of the native peoples, and militias and federal troops quickly mobilized. At the Battle of Bad Axe, U.S. troops killed over 200 men, women, and children, while about 70 white settlers and soldiers were killed in the whole conflict, which only lasted about 7 weeks. In this image, U.S. troops on a steam-powered riverboat are firing on fleeing Indians who are trying to get away on rafts. Over the course of the conflict, about 10 times more native people were killed than whites. In the end, the natives were forced to sign the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, which opened even more of their ancestral lands to white settlement. To some observers, the rise of Jacksonian democracy in the U.S. raised questions about this new power of the majority, the will of the people, to silence minority opinion. Some people worried that the rights of those who opposed this will of the majority would never be safe. Appeals to mass democracy also shaped political campaigns as never before. One of the most insightful commenters on American democracy was the young French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, whom the French government had sent to the United States to write a report on American prison reforms. Tocqueville toured the US, and he did write about prison reforms, but more famously, he wrote about the spirit of democracy that pervaded American life. Tocqueville's experience led him to describe democracy as an unstoppable force that would one day overthrow monarchy throughout the world. He published his findings in a 2-volume book called Democracy in America in 1835 and 1840, which analyzed the democratic revolution in the US and observed that the major benefit of democracy came in the form of equality before the law. The social revolution of democracy, however, did bring some negative consequences. Tocqueville described a new type of oppression, the tyranny of the majority, which could overpower the will of minorities and of individuals, and was, in his view, the new danger that was unleashed by mass democracy, however good it might generally be in the United States. Now, as I've mentioned previously, when Mexico began its war for independence, the Spanish government had sent a general named Agustín de Iturbide against Vicente Guerrero's forces, but Guerrero had beaten Iturbide in the field and then convinced him to join the revolution. In 1821, I want to remind you, the two allied under the Plan de Iguala, or the Plan of the Three Guarantees, which again proclaimed Mexico's independence and declared, and I'm going to say this again because I think it's so significant, quote, all inhabitants without distinction of their European, African, or Indian origins are citizens with full freedom to pursue their livelihoods according to their merits and virtues. Now, the part I didn't really get to last time was that shortly after this, Iturbide tried to declare himself Emperor of Mexico, and Guerrero and his supporters rebelled, and although this time Iturbide did defeat them in the field, he resigned when Antonio López de Santa Anna also rebelled. Santa Anna, who lived from 1794 to 1876, was a Criollo general. So he was of Spanish descent, but born in colonial Mexico, who, like Iturbide, had first defended the Spanish Empire against the early phase of the revolution, but had then switched to the patriot cause. Mexican politics are very complicated and turbulent. Suffice it to say that Santa Anna would end his life living in exile in Cuba and New York after 1855, and that both Iturbide and Guerrero ended up being executed in their turns. So Antonio López de Santa Anna, although he's not an American, figures largely in American history. He was born in 1794 into a wealthy Criollo family in Veracruz, which is the port city on the Gulf Coast that had been founded by Cortez in 1519, when he burned his ships there on his way to attacking Tenochtitlan. In 1810, as a 16-year-old, Santa Anna had joined the army against his parents' wishes and fought the early revolutionaries like Manuel Hidalgo y Costilla. He was wounded in battle, and by age 18, he had been promoted to lieutenant. When the royalist officer Agustín de Iturbide joined Vicente Guerrero in 1821 to support the revolution, Santa Anna had changed sides too. And as a reward for helping to drive off Spanish forces out of Veracruz, Iturbide had made Santa Anna a general. And Santa Anna was given control of the port of Veracruz, and he very rapidly became a regional caudillo, or strongman. Iturbide then removed Santa Anna from his post, and in 1822 Santa Anna joined the rebellion against Iturbide, who had declared himself emperor and had suspended the Constituent Congress. And so Santa Anna helped get rid of Iturbide, and then in 1828 he supported Guerrero, and Vicente Guerrero became the first black president of Mexico in 1829. And in 1829, Spain made their final attempt to reconquer Mexico, and Santa Anna led the forces that defeated the Spanish invasion. People began calling him, and he approved of this, the savior of the motherland, and even the Napoleon of the West. Later in 1829, a coup led by the vice president deposed and then executed Guerrero. And Santa Anna commanded the forces that opposed this new president who had taken power in the coup. And then in 1833, he was elected the 8th president of Mexico. And as I said, he would serve 11 non-consecutive terms over the next 22 years. And during his first term, he had his first run-in with the United States. Santa Anna is often criticized, especially in histories written in English, as an opportunist and as kind of a bad guy. But these American-focused histories may be a little bit guilty of demonizing the victim. In October 1835, a small group of settlers from the U.S. living in the northern Mexican territory of Tejas rebelled against the central government and declared their independence. The Tejanos were Americans who had migrated from the southern states and had brought their slaves with them. And they refused to free their slaves, which was a direct violation of the Mexican law. Because, as we've seen, Mexico had eliminated slavery in both the Plan de Iguala and in their 1824 Constitution. And by 1829, slavery was completely ended throughout Mexico, and a black man was president. The Tejanos insisted, though, that their slaves were legal because they were actually indentured servants for life. Now, the Mexicans, of course, understood that this was ridiculous, and the Tejanos and their supporters from the U.S. attacked and defeated Mexican army garrisons in the territory. President Santa Anna declared that any foreigners fighting Mexican troops, in his words, will be deemed pirates and dealt with as such, being citizens of no nation that is presently at war with the Republic and fighting under no recognized flag. Having defined these rebels as outlaws, since the U.S. government had remained silent on the issue, Santa Anna personally led the army to retake Texas. The Tejanos fortified an old mission called the Alamo, and Santa Anna overran it and killed them all. About a month later, a new Tejano force under Sam Houston managed to capture Santa Anna in the Battle of San Jacinto and held him hostage until he agreed to withdraw his army to the Rio Grande. Although Mexico never formally recognized the independence of Texas. And this will be the period of the famous Lone Star Republic of Texas, which Sam Houston will be the first and third president of, in the slightly less than a decade in which it will exist. The presidential election of 1840 marked the completion of what historians like to call the second party system in America, in which the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties are replaced by the Democratic and the Whig parties. Large-scale presidential rallies and emotional propaganda became the new style of campaigning. Voter turnout increased dramatically under the second party system. Only about 25% of eligible voters had gone to the polls and cast ballots in 1828. In 1840, voter participation reached nearly 80%. And the differences between the parties were largely economic. Whigs advocated accelerated growth, often endorsing federal government projects on internal improvements to the nation's infrastructure. And Democrats advocated a smaller role for the national government. The membership of the parties also differed along class lines. The supporters of Whigs tended to be wealthier. They were typically prominent planters in the South and wealthy urban Northerners, the people who had benefited from commerce and finance. And although the leaders of both parties were typically elite, Democratic politicians presented themselves as defenders of the common people against the elites. In the 1840 presidential campaign, possibly inspired by Democrats who had bragged of Andrew Jackson's military accomplishments, the Whigs promoted William Henry Harrison as a war hero based on his 1811 military service against the Shawnee chief Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, in the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison had run before against Van Buren and lost in 1836, receiving support only in his home region, where he had been the governor of the Indiana Territory and a congressman and then senator from Ohio. The 1840 campaign pushed Harrison into the national spotlight. Democrats tried to discredit him by saying, "Give him a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him, and take my word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin." The Whigs turned this slur to their advantage by leaning into the log cabin image and presenting Harrison as a man of the people who had been born in a log cabin. Of course, this was untrue. In reality, he came from a very privileged background in Virginia. But the contest did become known as the Log Cabin Campaign. At Whig political rallies, voters were treated to whiskey made by the E.C. Booze Company, leading to the introduction of the word booze into American speech. Tippecanoe clubs, where the booze flowed freely, helped in the marketing of this frontiersman candidate. The Whigs' efforts, combined with their strategy of blaming the Democrats for the lingering economic collapse that had begun with the hard currency panic of 1837, helped Harrison to win what many people consider to be the first modern election. But this victory did Harrison very little good, however. He became ill about 3 weeks after his inauguration in March 1841, and he died after about 9 days of illness and after about only 30 days in office, and was succeeded by his vice president, John Tyler. And Harrison's death was a huge disappointment for the Whigs, who had been hoping that he would help them pass a new higher tariff bill. Tyler, who was a former Democrat, turned his back on the Whig agenda and cut himself off from the party. So the 1840s open with a little bit of political chaos. And next time, we'll see how that leads to a major war with Mexico. But that's all for today. So I hope you found this a bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.